Hello everyone, thank you so much for joining in. Today is the 10th session of the Film Appreciation with Raghavendra sir. Today we're going to be talking about post-war European cinema. Thank you so much for joining in, sir. Let's take it away.
I'll say actually it's not post-war European cinema as much as post-war art cinema. Okay,
Yeah,
art cinema, art film, right? Now the point is, see what is art in cinema. What you normally called art in cinema includes a lot of commercial movies, right? Your Bollywood, all your Ford, your Hawks, your musicals, your noir, all this stuff, formulaic stuff, the genre stuff. It includes a lot of that kind of stuff, right? Now the point is, the art film is a special category. It must not be confused. You mustn't confuse the notion of art film with films of artistic value, right? There are any number of art films which are bad. There are any number of commercial films which are good. It's the same thing as in India. Of course, the origins are a little different. Okay, so it's a little different from India. So there are any number of. You can't say that when you say art film, it doesn't mean it's a high quality film. It doesn't mean that. It's a certain category which follows certain rules, and that seems to be the basic thing. Okay, okay. Now most cinema around the world has been popular cinema, commercial cinema. Now let's look at European cinema, where I think the origin of the art film is probably in Europe. The Europe, what is called European art, what is you called European cinema before World War II used to be French poetic realism. Okay, you had Renoir, you had Carne, Carne, you had Claire, René Clair, Jean Vigo, Julien Duvivier. All of them used conventional actors like Jean Gabin. Okay, they told conventional stories. They were all part of. Usually, noir was very popular. There was a lot of this, some realism of some sort. But basically, all of them used mainstream actors. They catered to a general public. Studio produced films. Okay, sometimes using uh, using classic novels and all that, filming of novels and all that. But basically, and they were very much like Hollywood in the sense that they were not difficult films. I mean, if you go to what you call a difficult film, difficult to understand film, I don't know when you went off into when you started getting into cinema, some movies were completely incomprehensible, right?
true. Yeah,
The Bergman, for instance, we look at the silence, it's completely incomprehensible. Persona, you're not comprehensible at all, right? Antonioni, these are very difficult filmmakers. You wouldn't find this kind of thing among the French directors like Renoir. You wouldn't find it among Carne. They're all storytellers. They're very much like the way Lynch is difficult. Altman was not, and even Altman was slightly difficult. The earlier ones were not. Orson Welles and all, they're not difficult. So the question is, because they were addressing large audiences, they were talking to large audiences. They were accessible to most people. For example, Vigo, you take Vigo, he's made only 2 or 3 movies. He's got a kind of cult reputation. Vigo, who did he use in Latelant? Michel Simon, right? Michel
yeah,
Simon is a big star.
yeah,
Same thing. Michel Simon has been in what's his Renoir's La Chienne. I mean, he's a big star. All of them big stars. So use big stars. Budget is a standard budget and that kind of thing. It is not art cinema in that sense, which is why when Renoir and all that went to Hollywood in exile during the war, they produced commercial cinema in the sense that the Southerner, okay, they produced commercial cinema. They did not produce what you call art cinema. The same thing with the Germans. Now, the other thing is the German expressionism. German cinema was also a commercial cinema. The the expressionism, the most I mean, greatest example would be your Robert Wine. But Robert Wine, Caligari, Cabinet of Dr. Caligari is not such a what is the word? It's not such a representative in the sense it's a unique kind of thing, right?
yeah,
More thing is people like Lang, Fritz Lang,
yeah.
Murnau. Okay, they went to Hollywood once again, and they seem to have did very well. In fact, if you take the greatest movies ever made, you will find Murnau Sunrise always there, for third or fourth or something there. Okay, and you see Sunrise. It's not a difficult film. It's a romantic melodrama. about love and this and that, but it's not a difficult film at all. The same thing you would find with Lang. Lang made thrillers of various
Yeah,
sorts. Okay,
Scarlet Street and all
yeah,
that.
yeah, all of them. Scarlet Street, of course, is like Chien is Renoir's version. Scarlet Street is Lang's version, very
Language.
different from each other. But basically, all of them were producing commercial cinema within the studio system. Okay.
Yeah.
Now let us go on to the Soviet realism. You look at Soviet realism. Soviet realism was produced under directives from the, as part of the revolutionary thing of production of art. So it was done with state support. So you had people like Pudovkin, Eisenstein, Ziga Vertov, all of them. They were making, they were producing. Now the point is that some, they were not very popular with the public, but they were not art films. They were closer to the avant-garde. I'll talk about the avant-garde a little later. And around 1933 or so, that was the end of Soviet realism. After that, it was decided that more people had to see movies, and this experimentation ended with this. I think the important movie at that time was Chapayev. So the Stalinist thing was that more people must see the movie. It must be accessible to people. All this experimentation is no use. So all these people lost their jobs, and they became teachers in the Moscow Film School. Okay. This is as far as Soviet realism goes. Now, Soviet realism is a very, very modernist kind of thing. It's experimental, very, they devise a language of cinema, people like Eisenstein, Pudovkin, and a lot of cinema owes to them. I mean, if you see Pudovkin, I'm actually more happy with Pudovkin than Eisenstein, because he seems to be, he's actually using kind of, filmmaking techniques which can be put to use today. Eisenstein, I don't know what it was. Okay. Yeah.
Well, when you talk about like film techniques, could you be a little specific about what was that differentiated Eisenstein and Pudovkin in terms of the technique?
There are the notion of montage. Okay.
Yeah.
The Eisenstein was a different kind of montage from Pudovkin. Pudovkin was a classical montage. It could be used in any kind of in other cinema as well. But Eisenstein, this abstract thing, he had some kind of thing of clashing there. You read it up in a textbook, you'll find all this. One was a sort of explosion. Cut was supposed to produce an explosion with Eisenstein's. This man was just conveying the story in some way, but with montage rather than your standard invisible editing like Griffith. Okay.
Yeah.
So you can check this out. There are a lot of things we've written about these two people. I think Pudovkin is more usable. I suggest that all of you look at Pudovkin's Mother. It's a very interesting film, purely for. It can be used even today. I don't know why it's not being used. It's not. It's actually, in my opinion, a more usable film than something like Potemkin. Okay. Now then you have the avant-garde cinema. Okay, the avant-garde cinema is experimental, and around the 1920s with the surrealists. Okay, Buñuel's Ancien Andaluz is very interesting. This was not made for a large public at all. Ancien Andaluz was made for a very small 30-40 people seeing the first. But the point is, all those guys who saw this Ancien Andaluz in the very first screening were all later became great artists. Max Ernst, okay, Andre Breton, okay, this guy De Chirico, okay, Giorgio De Chirico, Salvador Dali was involved in the movie. A lot of them, okay. A lot of these people who later went on to become great artists, theorists in cinema and 20th century literature, okay, 20th century literature and film and art, they were all involved in that. So the point is the avant-garde was not shown to a mainstream public. It was shown very specifically to highly arty public, intellectuals and that sort, right? Okay, who are already engaged in some kind of
So when the avant-garde films were like they were just starting out in the 20s, it was a fairly new medium back then. How come it took it only that little amount of a time just to see that experimentation of this level can be done in this? Like, how did that evolution?
Any new medium comes, it happens. No man ray photography was already there, right?
Yeah.
This is a moving image, and one important thing: all this experimentation took place in the silent medium, not in the talkie.
Yeah.
Okay, since it was a silent medium, it was cosmopolitan. Language did not come in the way. Okay, so a lot of this is silent with these legends telling you what's happening and that sort of thing. But the important thing is, any new medium comes along, automatically it will create experimentation, right? And that, post World War One, right? Post World War One, the important thing about that is, it was a very, the World War One created, I don't know if you're aware of this. A lot of the great writers of the 20th century, okay, they were all hanging around in Paris. Paris was a sort of epicenter after World War.
Yeah. Yeah.
People like Hemingway, Gertrude Stein, the whole lot, Picasso, all of them, okay. Because all of them are friends. Picasso, Dali, Buñuel, they were all close friends and knew each other. I don't know whether they're probably rivals or enemies also, but the point is they knew each other.
Yeah.
They all knew each other, and they knew each other's quirks. They knew, they were closely in it. It's really unbelievable today to us that you have Picasso, you have Buñuel, you have Dali, okay, you have all these people, right? All these people rubbing shoulders with each other, and these are the greatest guys, greatest. The contribution to cinema is much more, shall we say, is much more amazing than having the French New Wave together, which is actually small compared to the
Yeah.
the greatest minds of the 20th century are hanging out in each other's company. Okay, and this is something unbelievable. Okay,
Yeah.
so
Woody Allen had that in Midnight in Paris. He kind of showed
okay,
that.
yeah, I've not seen the film.
Yeah, it does.
But yeah, this entire thing of Paris being completely alive because of the great thing which was going on at that time. Okay, Picasso was only one of them, and they were all not famous. They were making their way around, right? None of them was already famous. They didn't have money. Antonin Artaud, a lot of them, big guys, right? So the thing is, this is avant-garde cinema. Now, go to the next slide. Art film is a stylistic category. Okay. The point is that the avant-garde were not influential. They were not influential. They were a small coterie producing art. They were not lapped up the way commercial cinema was being loved. Renoir was being loved. No, Renoir was much later. But I'm saying the 20s, there was already, for example, Abel Gance. Abel Gance was making movies. That would be commercial cinema, right? French silent cinema. These guys were not like that. They were more influential that way. These people were not influential. None of Buñuel's Ancien Andalou is a curiosity. The Surgeman and the Clergyman and the Seashell by Germain Dulac is another one. They're all
Yeah.
curiosities more than anything. They were not influential in the sense that they did not go in any way to strengthen cinema. They're not that way. They were not influential. Okay. Now we go to this art film as a stylistic category. All right. Now the important thing about the post-war art film is, we'll talk about what that post-war art film is. That they were that the art films from different countries, right, from all over the world actually exhibit characteristics which are somewhat similar. They are not doing the same thing as the earlier things, and the reason that came about is the growth of the film festivals. Now, if you take the very first film festival in the world was in Venice under Mussolini, right?
Yeah.
It was the first film festival in the world. That was more or less, they combined national cinema. They did, they called Americans. Then the second or third thing, they were giving awards only to German movies. All those Nazi propaganda movies were given awards in the second or third year, right?
Yeah.
The important thing is that this, as we understand the term, this Venice Film Festival was not that kind of film festival. First film festival, Cannes was started as a kind of, as a kind of
Reaction.
reactionary and a kind of reply to Venice. And the point is, the first thing was 1946, I believe, was the important festival. And the thing is that the total number of countries which participated in Cannes in 1946. See, that time the Cold War had started, right? And the West had to establish its own credentials as a promoter of freedom, as this and that, inviting countries from all over the world and that sort of thing. So these countries, they started submitting movies. And the point is, it became, at this particular point, it seems there was some kind of Hollywood films were not, they were, though Hollywood's contribution was there, and Hollywood not really an enemy, these films were actually positioned as against Hollywood, because Hollywood is commercial. So this entire thing of, having a national cinema, national art, now you can look at something like Ray. Ray came out of that.
Yeah.
When they started, you look at the kind of movies which came out of this, you will find, okay, national culture was what these films were generally asked to. So what happened was that this entire thing of inviting films coming along, it opened up in a, how the mechanics went about, I'm not too sure, but it opened up a thing and new kinds of movies were being made. It was not only Ray. It was not only Ray was Indian. French New Wave was a result of this, right? All this kind of thing. It it was a result of this opening up of the film festival space to new kinds of cinema, that kind of thing. And it was the opening up of the West as opposed to the East, which was, building up its own fortresses and all that, and things were going along there, right? Now, it seems 46 countries participated in the Cannes Festival of 1946. Okay, so what happened was, because this thing was thrown open to film, for example, new kinds of filmmakers started coming. It created an international audience. Okay, it was not the mass audience, it was an international audience which would watch these movies, and they would get selected viewings here and there. But that international audience, what it did was, the film festival, it created an international kind of cinema which was not there earlier. See, Renoir's movies are not international movies. Okay, they are basically French culture. The same thing with German cinema, right? It was basically Germanic culture. It was basically that. The same thing with Hollywood. It was basically American culture and American. That was the case. Probably Hollywood is more international now because it's
Yeah.
yeah. Those days it was not. So each country was making its own kind of cinema. But this post-war art film as a category, which came out of the Cannes Festival and the film festivals after that, I don't know which came after Cannes. Cannes was a reaction to, or was a reply to Venice, and Venice after the war was obviously in um, the some other. I mean, this it was maybe this. Yeah. So the question is, just look at the kind of which came from there, right? You had see, now you look at the kind of filmmakers who came from Europe. Let's take European filmmakers who'd been working earlier. You look at Bergman, right?
Mm.
Have you seen Bergman's earlier movies and his later movies? Wild
I've seen
Strawberries
mostly
is
yeah, later
very
movies.
different from each other, right?
Yeah, yeah.
If you look at Summer with Monica and all that, they're conventional movies made with actors and actresses with telling conventional stories. They are good films, but they are not. They don't prefigure something like
Seven Seal
Wild
or Bresson.
Strawberries, Seven Seal. They don't, right? It's the same thing. You take Bresson, Robert Bresson, for instance. If you take his film before the war, okay, before the war would be the Dames of Bois de Boulogne would be the pre-war film. The post-war film would be something like the Diary of a Country Priest. I don't know if you've seen this Diary of a
No.
Country Priest. Yeah, I mean it's completely different. I mean it's completely altered his language, everything. The point I'm trying to make is the same Italian neorealism. Italian neorealism was not prefigured by anything in the pre-war thing. Visconti, for instance, was a commercial filmmaker. I think he made that noir film about Postman
Oh no,
always.
that wasn't Visconti. There was this guy who, it was the treatment of Postman Always Rings Twice. It was called The Last Turning.
No,
I
no, no,
think
no, no, no,
Pierre Chanel. Pierre Chanel was the name of the
no,
guy.
no. This guy Visconti has made a movie. I don't know. I forget the name of that. The eel something. He's made a that thing about the adulteress and lover murdering the husband. I think he's made a movie. Yes, I forget the name of that movie. It was made before the war. Okay,
Oh,
he's made some such thing. The point is, all of them changed track after the war. They saw the kind of thing in Bicycle Thief is a completely new kind of movie, right? There'd been no precursor to Bicycle Thief. The
sure.
point is, it was the creation of these international audiences which created the art film. Now let us go into what the art film is. What are the characteristics of
That like the need to, for example, in terms of in the case of Bresson, he took a certain kind of a film language forward, which was like minimalist in
Manescaped
nature.
also, yeah.
Yeah. So was that out of the necessity of making it a universally appealing form?
It's not
Where
like that. See, the point is, once this art film came as a category, it was also allowed for a lot of expression. I'll come to that later. Okay, personal expression in some way, finding your own method, finding your own voice. It became very important. Okay, obsession, right? Obsession is the word.
obsession.
Yeah. I think it was a remake of Postman Always Rings Twice. Obsession is the word. Yeah, Visconti. Okay. Okay, the sources from which European art cinema borrowed, not it's not necessarily European, because we talk about Kurosawa also. For example, again, go to Japan. You go to Japanese cinema, you find Ozu and you find Mizoguchi, right? They
Yeah.
are not of the same category as Kurosawa. What is the Kurosawa's film which made a big splash?
Um,
Rashomon.
yeah, the Rashomon. Yeah,
Rashomon is a completely different kind of film from anything Mizoguchi had done, right?
true.
The same thing is very different from Ozu. Rashomon, I mean, we'll talk about it, it's modern in a certain way. It's modernist in a certain way that Mizoguchi was not. You can say that prior to the advent of the European of the art film, uh, if, all films were somewhat traditional in some sense, national culture, this sort of thing, right? Just as Indian cinema was traditional before Ray came and tried to do something, change it, and all that. The important thing is the important thing is that this advent of the art film as a category after the war, because of the film festival thing, created people like Kurosawa, created people like Godard, people created people like Truffaut, created people like Bergman. And when I say Bergman, I mean the later Bergman, Wild Strawberries and After, not the earlier Bergman. You look at him, he would not be very different from, he maybe he's a very good filmmaker, no doubt, but he's telling melodramatic stories, love and that sort of thing. It is not what you anticipate from Wild Strawberries. It's a completely different thing. And what what art cinema borrowed from was various, shall we say, devices of expressionism, of Soviet realism, of the avant-garde. So all of them it borrowed from. For example, you take something like Bergman. I don't know. You've seen Bergman is heavily expressionistic,
Yeah.
right? You take something like Sawdust and Tinsel. I don't know if you've seen that. I think it's really first really modernist kind of film. Sawdust and Tinsel. It's about this clown, and it's a pretty strong film. It's completely different. The kind of idiom he uses is completely different from whatever had been used by he himself had used earlier. Okay.
Yeah.
Now, yeah. So what I'm trying to say is, okay, Italian, all of them, they broke away from that. Now, what are the characteristics? What are the characteristics of this new cinema that these guys created? We'll go into that. Okay.
Yeah.
Let's go to the next slide.
Next slide, please.
How art cinema defines itself. Now, it defines itself in relation to classical Hollywood in some sense, right? Classical Hollywood, as I already said last, this is where it connects up with last session.
Yeah.
Classical Hollywood is important. Okay. It is important because it has a certain set of laid down rules, right? It follows that and it delivers a certain thing. So the question is, it's like this, you're a writer, okay?
Yeah.
You're a writer, and you are producing a conventional narrative. At some particular point, you have a shall we say, a public already, a readership, right? Once you have a readership, what will you do? What did James Joyce do? Okay, now you know that you can take chances. They know my writing, they know what I'm doing. So the question is, I take chances and I start experimenting. Okay. So I start leaving out. For example, I found out that Bresson, his films are like some kind of shortcut, There are seems to be sentences are missing in the middle. That is the way.
True.
To give you an
Yeah.
example, to give you an analogy, Bresson is the kind of filmmaker where the connecting sentences between two different things will be missing. That kind of thing, right? He takes a shortcut in many ways. So the question is, you are forced to, what are these, grammatically? So he's actually experimenting with grammar, coming up. Minimalism is actually unnecessary detail. He'll eliminate. He will eliminate actors trying to
Emote and
putting their
everything.
own stuff, emote unnecessarily, and that sort of thing, right? So the question is, what are the three important things of classical narrative? First thing is verisimilitude. Is this event plausible? Okay, is it believable? Is the first thing, right? The second one is not possible but plausible, right? Is it plausible? Number two is it consistent with this kind of story? That is generic appropriateness. This genre, does it belong to this genre? Is it okay? Can you have this kind of event in this kind of genre? When you, most of them actually work with, for example, you take Godard, okay, he works with the gangster film, right? The very first one, not always. I'm saying
Yeah.
the very first
Breathless.
film, Breathless. His gangster film is his model in some way. I think, yeah, the B gangster film was his model, of course. But that thing, what is Monogram Pictures or something? America, they were making these movies. All of them follow this. generic appropriateness. Can this be allowed in a story? Like, it's not like Indian cinema where there are no such thing as generic appropriateness. You'll have songs, dances, romances in any kind of movie, including the horror movie, right? There, generic appropriateness is very important. Then you have this thing, okay, compositional unity, which is, does it advance the story? Does this event help the story in any way, or is it just extraneous? So that thing has this compositional unity has to do with your causality, right? Does it advance the story in any way? I think if any of you want to write stories, if you write chapters are like steps, okay, you go to the next chapter, you would have climbed one step, you can't go back. So it's a useful way of measuring out how to plot a novel or plot a story, is that every single step you take, you round it off at a chapter that you've taken one step, you can't come back. Okay, this is a useful way. Okay, so does it advance the story is a very crucial thing. Now, when we come to art cinema, post-war art cinema, these linkages are much looser in art cinema. Any issues up to here? It's okay, no?
Yeah.
They're much looser. So what happens is, it is more realistic in the sense it's shot on locale. Okay. See, we talk about Hollywood as realism in some way. Okay, but it's not. Is it realistic, Hollywood?
No.
What is realistic? What would you call realistic?
I mean, anything that gives a sense of the time and space that is seen is setting.
That Hollywood does. That Hollywood does.
But in the sense, like, it feels authentic in the way that this is believable. This is happening right there.
It's also no. The story is very rounded.
Yeah.
The story, it has a climax. It's rounded in a certain way. It gives you full satisfaction. Whereas reality, if you take reality that we experience in everyday life, it is not satisfying, right?
Yeah.
Reality we experience in everyday life is not satisfying. Yeah. Complex, and we'll come to that, complexity and ambiguity. See, the point is, complexity and ambiguity are also there in Renoir.
Yeah, true.
Okay, they're also there in Renoir. It is there in
Hitchcock as well.
Hitchcock. It is there in Mizoguchi. But that is a different kind of thing. They are not introducing ambiguity and complexity as an element that way. Okay. Because the visions they come up with, so it's so complicated. What happens is that per force, you take something like Rules of the Game, you take something of Renoir's Rules of the Game, you will find it's a very complex film.
Definitely.
It's not complex like Bergman is complex. Okay. It is still understandable. If you look at it very clearly, a person who watches the movie will be able to understand it in its totality. You may find miss out this detail or miss out that detail. It's completely comprehensible. All right. Now, the realism of art cinema is a different sort. Okay, you're dealing with real problems of everyday life, which are difficult to define, like alienation. Like, for example, who knows what alienation is? Incapacity to move. For example, have you come across people, their limbs are frozen. Okay. Tomorrow they're going to lose their job. They're going to do something. They're going to, their families are going to break up. Today they can't take action. Okay. This is a thing out of everyday situation that we have. Okay. That everyday situation that people are stuck in certain paradigms, in certain frozen situations. They can't move forward at all. I don't know if you come across this. This is a frequent thing. You think, this chap knows that tomorrow he's going to lose his job, tomorrow he's going to be fired. Today, if he sits and does something, he'll be saved. He won't sit and do that.
Yeah.
Okay. No, that kind of thing you will not find in the Hollywood thing. That, mental blocks. You see, this is the kind of stuff like this art cinema, mental blocks, alienation, writer's blocks. What are the other things you've written? Sexual anxiety. Okay. These are things which you don't find in classical cinema. You will not find it in French cinema, pre-war French cinema. You will not find it. That kind of thing you will not find at all. Japanese cinema, you will not find it. But as you come into the modern era, when you come into the post-war era, suddenly you find these new categories coming in. Okay. Okay. Now let's look at some. Let's look at some of this. Okay. Characters and situations are psychologically complex. We don't know. For example, I don't know how many of you seen Bresson's Gentle Creature. Have you ever
Gentle
seen?
Creature.
Kumar Shani had a small role in it. I think he also collaborated in the film.
Yeah, he assisted him.
He assisted him. It's very interesting. What is this? What is this reason for this husband behaving like that towards a woman? We don't know. Okay. She seeks him out and he marries her. He goes out of his way to make her unhappy. When he is prepared to give her happiness, she's no longer in a position to receive it. I mean, such a strange movie.
Yeah.
The point is that kind of cinema you never would have found before the war. Okay, this is the point. The thing is that after the war, they became realistic in a new way, and what happened was characters have no goals. They act inconsistently. Okay, they act completely. You've seen Antonioni is the passenger. You've seen
Yeah.
what is exactly is he doing? What would you, without using the word alienation, which are really, I mean, what is that term? We frequently use this term alienation. Does anybody know what that? Can we identify an alienated person among our friends? Can we do that?
No.
I have my own doubts about that. Okay, the point is that these are, I mean, it's not that we don't notice it. We just say, okay, ennui is boredom. Ennui is boredom. Yeah, correct. But in some way, yeah, you're right. Ennui, boredom also is, I mean, is a kind of, lethargy. You can't move yourself.
No.
You can't do anything.
Was this sudden like change, like post-war? Was this only because they had to make a standpoint against Hollywood?
No. It's not. It is not a standpoint against Hollywood. Okay. It was because new screen space was created, new opportunities were created. It was possible for people to even break away from their own commercial cinemas, what they themselves had done in the past, right? If you take Les Dames of the Water Ballon of Bresson, you will see that Bresson's film is fairly conventional. It's an excellent film, not that it's not an excellent film, but the point is conventional acting, conventional in every way. The emotions are conventional, all that is there. It works like a novel, it works like that. It is not like Antonioni, it's not like Bresson's later stuff. Okay. Suddenly you could say things, you could actually include, you could include all kinds of things in your movie, which were not even acknowledged. I mean, nobody in India makes a movie, made a movie about this guy who can't act at all, who can do nothing. Okay. He's simply stuck in there. Have you come across such a film? Hollywood certainly wouldn't produce a film like that. That kind of character, at least, wouldn't have in the classical era up to 60. A guy who's completely. I mean, haven't you come across such people? Yeah, you would have come across such people who can't
Yeah.
help themselves. People who steal without being able to help themselves. Okay.
Yeah. There is a film that came out, but of course, it isn't as popular.
They would probably use it from the other side. That is to catching him and that sort of thing, right?
No, the
I mean, a
very
protagonist.
recent one. Very recent one. They
Recent,
started
yeah,
coming
and
in.
not in the now. Of course, all these things will automatically go. Okay, so the question is this open-endedness, people having doubts with their own lives, having doubts about their own lives. These are all things which are in fundamental component of the art film. Okay.
But ultimately, all this happened because Cannes kind of opened things up. After
Yeah,
Cannes,
Cannes, and
it
then
was the
the film festival.
nationalization.
Yeah, film festival started. Yes, right. Once the film festival started, they knew it could be shown here. They could show these movies. You look at something like Rashomon. There's nothing in Japanese cinema before that. I'm not a great fan of that movie, but there's nothing in Japanese cinema to compare with Rashomon. Kurosawa himself had made an action movie. I think Sanchuro Sagata or something he had made. I forget. He had made an action film. So the point is that this is the kind of movies these people made, which is very different from the earlier stuff. Now let's go to the next slide. Okay, let's look at some motives, right? La Atalante is made in 19.
Yeah.
Atalante doesn't belong here.
That's
Okay.
a political realistic film.
Yeah. Yeah. L'Atalante is not in this. L'Atalante is an earlier film. It belongs to is a somewhat unusual kind of film. It's certainly not post-war art cinema. Okay. Protagonists having doubts about their own lives and that doubts being manifested as journeys. That's a very important thing. These journeys, Wild Strawberries, The Seventh Seal, aimless journeys, La Strada. Okay. They don't go from one place to another. L'Atalante is not like that, by the way. It's not an aimless journey. This chap is working on a barge and he's got his wife and he has to take that barge from some place to Paris and bring it back. That is the thing. It's not an aimless journey. If you look at, for example, Wild Strawberries, it's an aimless journey, right? It's not exactly an aimless journey.
It has a destination, but
no, it has a destination, but his mind is a parallel journey.
True.
Can you name an Indian film which is inspired by wild strawberries?
Yeah. In that's why the wild strawberries. No. Like there's no such film.
Nayak,
Nayak.
Rez Nayak.
Raise Nayak. Yeah, but yeah, it's still like in that sense,
It
it's
is.
there,
He's
but
going to receive a felicitation somewhere.
true.
Okay. He's going on a train and he's reflecting on his past. He also has a dream in which this death concerned with death. Yeah, okay. It's obviously very, very closely, what's it
Yeah, I
called,
never saw
inspired.
it.
Yeah.
I never saw it like that
Nayak is actually a very close thing of, I mean, it's not a close,
because it's not as expressionistic, I think, which
it's
is
not
why the
expressionistic. It's
link
not.
is
No, that is
yeah,
expressionistic. This is not. That is true.
true.
Even that thing about the skeleton coming out of the hand out of the
Yeah,
money is
yeah.
more a kind of didactic thing than money is death and that sort of thing. There it's not the case. There's something else, right? Here there's a certain didactic element in Nayak. Okay, then you have this Kings of the Road. You should see this. I mean, these are all great films. I think Kings of the Road is Wenders, about two guys post-war Germany just going around. Okay, going around and fixing projectors in porn theaters and that sort of thing. La Strada again. Then the second thing is ideals. That is Jules and Jim. That is some brief moment of great happiness and great thing which is going to pass. They do all kinds of things. It's as if it's aimless, but it's a great, very it's pleasant pleasure, a great name of pleasure. Jules and Jim. Elvira Madigan. I don't know if you've heard of Elvira Madigan.
No.
It's Bo Widerberg, Swedish film, interesting one. Then Piero Le Fou of Godard. Okay.
Yeah.
Sometimes you have this thing of filmmaking as a search without an end. Okay. So the question is, it allows using filmmaking as a motive. Okay, a person in search of an idea, in search of his own life, allows you this kind of complete open exploration. It allows this complete open exploration where nothing needs to be defined, right? You could generally say that all these films try to define their own plots or define their own purposes as indistinctly as possible. Okay, or sometimes it's growing up. Okay, 400 blows. Again, what happens is this growing up story. Again, if a child is growing up, all experiences are there in the thing of growing up, right? Okay.
Yeah.
Look at this. You look at 400 blows. You look at Pather Panchale. You can look at. They're open-ended in a certain way. A child growing up doesn't grow up to be anything. All right. This is not like some of the other later growing up films. So this thing of growing up story is one more which allows an open ending. Okay, and they say this is an interesting called the survey form of the narrative. It's very Turkish. Okay, Oglu would be Turkish. The survey form of the narrative, that is occupations they take, like prostitute who does nothing. Okay, who's just hanging around, allowing people whatever their I mean, she's just handling people. Same thing with your journalist. Journalists are people who just go from place to place collecting information. Their lives are inherently aimless in some sense because they're surveying things, right?
Yeah.
They don't have a purpose except this thing of experiencing, right? So they have this prostitute, for instance, in Vivre sa Vie, Knights of the Cabiria. You have the journalist in Blow Up. I think Blow Up is a photographer.
Blow Up is a photographer.
Yeah, photographer. The Passenger is a journalist. Then La Dolce Vita is a. So the question is, using occupations like this. Okay, like for example, you take journalist. Let's take journalist. If you take La Dolce Vita or you take The Passenger, this kind of journalist in The Passenger or La Dolce Vita is very different from the kind of journalist in His Girl Friday, right?
Yeah.
There, the journalist has a purpose. He's going after the truth. He's trying to save somebody's life, right? There is, or the front page, Billy Wilder's The Front Page. There, the thing is that the journalist has a purpose. It's not this kind of journalism. Here, journalism is shown as some kind of thing where you have no purpose in life. You're generally going around, whatever comes your way. It's actually pessimistic view of journalism. I'll say Passenger. Okay. Even this thing of his death, how does he die? What is the cause for that? I mean, it's a certain openness. So this has been defined as a cinema of psychological effects in search of their causes. This is interesting. Okay. The causes we don't know. Why the passenger? What is the reason for the passenger? You can only use that word alienation, which really doesn't tell you anything at all. But the point is, he's completely incapable of working. He's completely. Why does he change places with somebody who's already dead and take his position as a gun runner or something? Why does he do that? The point is, you are asked to interpret. Okay, you have documentary factuality, like various things like neorealism. Okay, where it's like almost like done like a documentary. Then you have intense subjectivity, like you have in Antonioni. Okay, so you have commitment to both psychology, which is not really revealed. It's not like your American films where the psychology is, I mean, it's up front. They tell you that this is the reason when he was a boy, his father did something to him, and therefore because of that he became like that. This is not like that.
Yeah.
Okay. The point is, it's a certain psychological condition that you cannot pin down. We don't know what its purpose, how it arose, and this is basically it. Okay, subjective verisimilitude. If you take like something like Rashomon, it's basically throwing doubt, right?
Yeah.
So the basic thing is all these movies, where the earlier movies used to come up with some kind of not exactly certainties, some kind of traditional worldview, exploring the traditional worldview. These films went off into this thing of uncertainty. Uncertainty is where what these films breed on, right?
Yeah.
You go to the next slide, foregrounding of the author. So the classical Hollywood, you ask question, okay, wherever it departs from classical Hollywood, okay, let's take an example, right? Let us take a detective is trying to solve a crime. The day before he solves his crime and is about to do this, he's run over by a car. No, it's possible. It's possible in real life.
Nope.
You won't have this in a Hollywood movie. You won't have that, right? But you could have it in a Goddard movie, right?
True.
You get me? The reason is somehow the issue is if such a thing happens, then you are forced to ask, what is the director trying to say? What happens is the director inserts himself into the film. What am I trying to say? Let them figure out what I am trying to say. This is the basic thing. Okay. So the thing is that different people adopt different ways of dealing with this thing of realism. Okay, dealing with basic thing is about around the same thing, same time. Your Truffaut came up with this, what was called the author theory. I don't know if you're aware of this.
Yeah.
It's a well-known thing.
Yeah.
But there, what he was doing was that he was trying to find in studio filmmaking from Hollywood. He was finding out signatures. What is Nicholas Ray's personal signature? What is John Ford's personal signature? What is Hitchcock's personal signature? And he was basically finding in studio filmmaking this kind of personal signature. But when you look at the post-war art film, the personal signature is intended. Okay, Ford was not aware that he was putting in a personal signature, but they deciphered that personal signature by looking at his films. These guys in the later period, in the 50s and all that, people like.
Why did, like, say, Truffaut go to like studio filmmaking for that, to decipher those?
This Bazin, I'll tell you, Andre Bazin was their guru, right?
Yeah.
So the point is, American cinema has always been the model in some way. We may detest American cinema. Many people may detest American cinema, people who favor this. But it has always been the model. In fact, Bordwell says you can't get beyond Hollywood. You have to go through Hollywood. So the question is, all these guys went through Hollywood. The point is that Hollywood, the people like Truffaut preferred Hollywood to French cinema before their own time, right? Hollywood is very important. Of course, not all Hollywood. But stuff like Ford, stuff like Nicholas Ray, stuff like Raoul Walsh, people like not so much Wells, who was already an author in some way. Okay,
Yeah.
Wells is different from the others. Wells was some kind of independent filmmaker very early. He was some kind of pre-Kubrick, right?
Yeah.
He was somewhat like Kubrick, independent in some way, making his own kind of movies. Yeah, they Walsh, Hitchcock. Yeah, all of them were fans of Ford, Ray, Raoul Walsh, Nicholas Ray, and Hitchcock. Yeah, but what was I talking about?
Orson Welles as an independent.
Wells is different, right? Wells was somehow he managed to, because of his maverick qualities, because he was considered a genius, he managed to win freedom for himself as a filmmaker. It's the same thing with Kubrick. Okay, Kubrick cannot be placed in American cinema in the standard way.
Exactly.
He's completely different, right? He's not like the others. All the others somehow or other relate to genres. Kubrick is not like that. Kubrick is a maverick who considered a genius. Very early he was considered a genius. And because he's a genius, is allowed to do things which other people don't do. It was the same thing with Wells in his time. He was generally declared a genius because of whatever. He was very young and he was called a genius. And so this chap, he's completely different. Wells and Kubrick should be taken outside American cinema. They don't really belong there. Okay. Now, important thing is, there is a what is this in art cinema is, there's a violation of the classical norm. Okay, what is this violation of the classical norm? Okay, deviations from unusual camera angles. Okay, which you could take from expressionism, for instance. Okay, prohibited camera movement. This is interesting. What is the term? Can you give me an idea, example of a prohibited camera angle from a post-war art film? Idea, what does it mean? I tried to sort of, somebody asked me this question, and it suddenly struck me. You've seen La Ventura?
Yeah.
What about that scene in the deserted, that ghost town, right?
Yeah.
You remember that ghost town?
Yeah.
What is that camera? Who is looking at them? You remember that scene? When the camera comes along, I mean, I wish you could see this movie, La Ventura. There is these two people go to this ghost town, there's nobody there. But the camera has got a position somewhere on top, and then it moves as if somebody's eye is there.
Exactly, yeah.
Right? Yeah. Whose eye is that? It's never made clear in the movie, right?
Throughout the movie, there are angles like that.
Yeah, but I know it's like that. So the point is that prohibited camera angle is very necessary for us to understand that movie. That's a very crucial thing. We can't really say, why is it? Who is looking at them like that, as if, eye is watching? That eye is never justified in the narrative, right?
True.
The point is, it's a violation. It's a kind of violation of classical rules of filmmaking when you have certain angles and certain camera movement, which is not there, which is not justifiable at all in terms of narration. You have unrealistic lighting, breakdown of causality. For example, if something like Blow Up, a complete breakdown of causality. Then you have this thing of the plot. The plot is much more important than the story in a lot of these movies. You look at take something like Rivet, Celine and Julia Go Boating. You take Celine and Julia Go Boating. The plot is much more important. What is the plot? The plot is the way the story is rearranged in the course of making the movie, right? If you take something like Pulp Fiction, okay, plot is very important in Pulp Fiction. If you rearrange the whole of Pulp Fiction in a chronological way, the movie will lose all value, right? Sure. The plot is important because plot is the way the author lays out his story in order to make a point. What do you think is the point in Pulp Fiction? Why does he do that?
To rearrange the story?
Rearrange the story in that way. Does anybody have an idea? This is a question I would like to put to anybody who has an idea. Why? What do you take that the plotting thing of Pulp Fiction?
It's basically
why does he rearrange the chronology in that way? What do you think is the reason? If you want to interpret it,
the way I've read it is like almost in a sense to talk about redemption, the idea of redemption, in like when Butch murdered someone, and directly he'd almost dies, and then there's that certain.
You know what is my thing? Okay, if you rearrange the film chronologically, you will find it ends with this Butch, who's the crook actually.
And he leaves. That's what I'm saying.
Rotten fellow. He's a rotter. Okay. With his triumph.
Yeah.
Okay. Whereas if you're told in terms of the plot, it ends with redemption.
Yeah.
So the question is, what you could understand it is that simply by retelling it, reality can be told in some way as to make it optimistic, make it pessimistic. So reconstructing reality to draw some kind of moral from it is the way I see it.
Yeah.
So finally it ends, and the point is where it ends is actually supposedly an earlier scene. It should have happened earlier.
Much
earlier. Redemption comes in the middle, ends with pessimism. So the question is, you rearrange in the story, Butch is a crook. I mean, there's no other word for that fellow, right? Whereas this chap actually has some kind of religious experience. So Vega, not Vincent Vega, the other guy.
Jules.
Yeah, Jules. And look at Vincent Vega, such a good, nice guy. He's killed off right at the beginning by this crook. Okay. Yeah. So that's it. The point is that this thing of throwing your weight on the plotting in such a way as to retell a story, okay, is a way of the author asserting himself, asserting his own signature thing. The world may be whatever it is, but I'm going to make this of the world. You understand my point?
Yeah.
That is what this is all about, right? Okay, then you come to what happens.
So Pulp Fiction, one would categorize Pulp Fiction as an art film.
No, actually, no. I'll come to that later. Okay,
Okay.
we'll come to that. See, art cinema is modernist in many ways.
True.
Okay, I'll talk about it a little later. Just give me 2 minutes.
Yeah.
See, the point is realism and authorial subjectivity are building blocks, but they're contradictory. You understand my point? Okay. Art cinema resolves this contradiction by introducing the term of ambiguity. Now, this ambiguity, for example, you take the ambiguity of Blow Up, Antonioni's Blow Up. All over, many of you would have seen this movie, right? Antonioni's Blow Up.
Yeah.
You really can't understand that movie. Okay, what exactly he's doing? You're completely intrigued by it, right? But I cannot understand it the way I would understand the rules of the game, for instance, right? So the point is this open-endedness. So the point is what is finally this ambiguity rather than complexity. Ambiguity becomes an operating principle. Now you take, for example, you take Godard's gangster films. They made. You take Truffaut's Shoot the Pianist. You take that. There are certain aspects in Truffaut's Shoot the Pianist which you won't find in normal noir. It's also noir, right?
Yeah.
You've got this thing of anxiety on his part. You've got a psychological condition of this pianist. Covered as something, okay? A certain psychological condition which you won't find. His failure is based because of his psychological condition. So that kind of thing you won't find in standard noir. You get my point? Okay. So all these movies are basically, it's like this detective. I mean, this is simply not permissible at all in a classical detective story. That the detective fails because of personal weaknesses that he has, right? He can't confront something. He can't because of certain cowardice. The thing doesn't come through. Okay, that sort of thing you can't have in a classical detective story. But in a modernist detective story, with all these guys belong. Okay, you can call it modernist. All this cinema is modernist. The whole of post-war art cinema is modernist cinema in some way, which means they want to break with the past. Okay, for the one definition of modernism which will hold is that they all want to break with the past, create something new which has not been done before, admit new content into their stories, into their poetry, into their into their films. Right, that is the basic thing. So the point is the subjectivity. Okay, this ambiguity becomes an operating principle in film. So the thing is, the meaning of the film is attributed to one, the deviation from classical thing, one, realism in the sense of life's untidiness. Life is not like a story. Okay, life is untidy. Okay, all kinds of the things happen in life which we will not allow into a story. You get my point? That
Yeah.
realism in that sense. Okay, it's untidy. Now that kind of untidiness of everyday lived life is something which earlier cinema would not have allowed. You would not allow that kind of untidiness. So these people deliberately allow that life's untidiness. Character subjectivity is another important thing, and authorial vision is another thing. Character subjectivity is you put in brackets. What is this guy? You have this thing of clouding the thing between what is happening and what he's imagining. That kind of thing. So you start bringing in this. So character subjectivity is a key thing. You will not find that in many of the earlier movies. This character subjectivity is as an operating principle. See, in Indian cinema, probably the only film which has tried to do this character subjectivity systematically is your Adur's Anantaram, right? It's the only one where they actually, put some kind of, even Ray has not done that as far as I know, character subjectivity systematically. That to actually, talk about what is the truth, is what we are seeing, what did it really happen, or is it imagined, that kind of thing, ambiguity between the two things is something which Indians haven't done. But there was some movement in the 70s or so with especially the Malayalis, where this character subjectivity became a key thing. Okay, Ray, you have in stuff like in Pratidwandi, you have that skeleton seeing
Yeah.
that medical, but it's not really in a sustained way like you have in Anantaram, for example. Okay, this is it. Okay, then ambiguity is an important thing. As I said, ambiguity not in the sense of the Mahabharata being ambiguous or rules of the game being ambiguous, ambiguity as an operating principle. Okay, we are puzzled by what is being shown. That puzzling film is a key thing for these art cinema. And the thing is, the important moral is, when in doubt, okay, about the meaning of the film, read for maximum ambiguity. Okay, so there's a lot of thing in this kind of cinema which actually, so the question is a lot of, now you're talking about, now let me answer this question about Tarantino, right? This, when initially this had all Hollywood was not included in this circle of art cinema, post-war art cinema, but it made its effect. If you've seen, for instance, Coppola's The Conversation,
Yeah.
Coppola's The Conversation, okay, and Antonioni's Blow Up are similar. My friend Babu, who's sitting here, pointed out that this is a kind of oral and that is visual version of the same thing. The important thing is that the words are ambiguous in Coppola's. What exactly are they saying? What is the meaning of the words? Here, the image is ambiguous, right? But
Yeah.
both of them are operating ambiguously. It's the same thing with something like Altman's Three Women. Have you seen Altman's Three Women?
Yeah.
You've seen that. Again, it's a kind of takeoff from art cinema, of European art cinema. Yeah, art cinema. It's a kind of, it's a derivative of arts of European art cinema. Three Women. His other movies are not like that. He seemed to want to make an art film. So you come to this man's Tarantino's Pulp Fiction. It's a little different. What do you think is in terms of mood? What is the difference between Tarantino and somebody like Altman? Okay.
Tarantino is much more, it's much more pop culture-ish in a way.
It is playful, right?
Playful. Yeah.
He's playful, right? Now the point is, all these earlier guys were high modernism, and modernism was very serious about what it went about, right?
True.
Very serious. The modernist artists was trying to find a new thing of perception, new kinds of ways of looking at things, new ways of telling stories. This is a fundamental thing of modernism, right? This is postmodern. Postmodern mimics modernism without its high seriousness. Okay, it is like this. If you want to find a parallel in Indian cinema, if you look at Rajesh Khanna, high seriousness, right? Rajesh Khanna is always high seriousness. Okay, if you see Govinda doing hero number one, which is some kind of take on Bawarchi, Govinda can be called postmodern in relation to Rajesh Khanna. You get my point?
True. Yeah.
Okay, it's not actually mockery. It's a kind of mimicry of something.
Mimicry.
Not really making fun of it in some sense. It's a kind of mimicry without the high purpose of that thing. So postmodernism can be called a kind of playful mimicry of modernism, right? So that's the way it works. Okay. Now, any questions up to here? So any issues on this? Is a slightly complicated thing, but the basic thing is
Not spoofs
not
exactly.
spoofs. Spoof is parody. Okay. Spoof is parody. Mel Brooks is spoof. Okay. Mel Brooks is spoof. This is what is called pastiche. 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 It is parody without its humor. It is not debunking. Okay. You mimic something, you don't debunk it. Whereas you take somebody like pastiche, yeah. But you take somebody like Mel Brooks, he's parodying. Okay. You take yeah, it's postmodern. Yeah, it is
It is
postmodern.
postmodern, yeah.
Lynch also, in many ways, though I think Lynch is also very serious. He's doing satire, I think. I think Tarantino is not a serious filmmaker in the sense that he's only doing it with form. He's being very playful. He's not the high moral seriousness or the, shall we say, metaphysical seriousness of art cinema
film, yeah.
is not to be found in Tarantino. But the point is, this is the way all these things sit together. Okay. This is it. Any questions? I'll be happy to take any questions up to here. It may be slightly difficult. Please ask me any questions at all. Generally with this. So what you must understand, that is, art film is not a European category. It arose out of movements in Europe or arose out of this. So that what happens is you have a lot of this stuff. You've got Japanese new wave. You've got new German cinema. Okay. You've got they were all started off new German cinema. Somebody asked about French new wave. Okay, Italian neorealism. Okay, these are all movements which came out because of the thing of the art house cinema. The art cinema of started off by the film festival circuit. Okay, so all this would represent the high modernism of world cinema, and probably the period when it came closest to the ambiguity of modernist literature, like Joyce, your Kafka, your Camus. For example, there's a lot of similarity between Antonioni and ideologically. See, postmodernism is basically playing the fool. Okay, it's a kind of, It's modernists were very, very serious about what they were doing morally in terms of where the world was going. Okay, they were extremely. I wouldn't use the word ideology at all. They were trying to decipher the world in some sense. There was high seriousness in their purpose, right? Postmodernism is actually mimics many of those, but they're throwing it away on jokes and that sort of thing, right? They throw it away. So the question is, it's campy. I don't know how this word. I mean, it's probably a new word for you. It's frivolous. It's flippant. You can take Tarantino is flippant in some way. Not you take something like Kill Bill. What is the seriousness of Kill Bill?
I mean, yeah, it's a revenge drama,
Yeah,
but of course,
Rajesh Khanna and Govinda would tell you the difference. If Rajesh Khanna is representing a social type, Govinda is representing the Bollywood hero as a type, archetype, right?
true.
So does actual mimicry of Rajesh Khanna. Rajesh Khanna is meeting statespersons and working as a cook for them. Govinda is meeting film stars and working as a cook for them. I've got an offer from Madhuri Dixit to become a cook in her house. If you don't give me the job, I'll have to go and take up the job with Madhuri Dixit. Now, this is very different from what Rajesh Khanna did. Okay.
Yeah.
Day for Night, right. Day for Night is again a kind of thing of a filmmaker thing, no? 8.5. I told you that, right? Day
Yeah.
for Night, 8.5. This is the thing
But
of the
say like
search, the filmmaking as a search.
Perilefu.
Piero Lofu, yeah, Piero Lofu. Yeah, wait a minute, I can't recollect the film. Yeah, I do. It's about this. If these two people hung up somewhere, have nothing to do, mimicking Americans.
They're running away, basically.
It's a political thing, actually. Running away. It's a political thing. Obviously, these guys have no work, nothing, right? This guy has no work. He's reading out when the film begins. I think he's reading out some high criticism of art or something to a little child or something. If you remember that, right? He's reading out high criticism of little art criticism, which the child will not understand. It's reading out art criticism about Velasquez or something to this little child. That's the way the film begins. So the point is this: that who they took
Perilefu.
No, it's no. Pure Lofu is serious stuff. You're dealing with alienation. You're dealing with meaningless of knife and all that. Okay.
It's just that the nature of those characters
See, all these existentialism is all of them were there. Your Camus was not the only one. There were other things also. Bergman, for instance, is closer to Kafka in many ways. Okay, existentialism is probably something like Antonioni would be somewhat close to existentialism, but there are so many other threads, no? You've got Antonio, you've got Bresson, you've got Godard, you've got the whole French New Wave, are all different from each other. You've got Rivette, you've got Chabrol, you've got Bergman, there's a lot of stuff here. Okay, a lot of Fellini, Italians. The Italians went in different ways. Of course, some of them became very political, like Rossi. They were not really part of. They were very different from this. But you can take these entire European cinema, this uncertainty, this openness, this thing as some kind of modernist thing, and as a result of the film festival circuit. Okay. Any other questions?
similarities between Antonio and
Camus, I would say.
Camus. Albert Camus.
Say, yeah, the Guest. There's a story of Camus, Albert Camus, called The Guest. You can read that story and then look at The Passenger. I think there's a lot of similarity between The Passenger and The Guest. Okay. Camus, Albert Camus. It's very, very similar in many ways. Almodovar, possibly. I'm not too sure. I think Almodovar, okay, is not of this thing at all. He's a commercial filmmaker.
Totally.
He's hugely popular. Okay. He's a commercial filmmaker who has come out of I mean, you take something like, this kind of ambiguities are not there in Almodovar. Almodovar is making melodramas, but the subjects of his melodramas are unconventional, like your gay person, transvestite, and that sort of thing. But basically, he's making melodramas, fully rounded films. Not his earliest stuff. I'm talking about his last stuff. Earlier stuff, he was doing parodies, actually. Parodies and jokes kind of thing, that kind of thing. Parody is basically parodic. Third cinema is a political cinema which came later. I'm not talking about that here at all. That's not in the same thing. That was a very radical political cinema of Glauber Rocha and that sort of thing. Usman Sembene and that sort of thing. That came little later. I'm talking about the first category, Yusuf Shaheen, okay, Lester James Perry's of Sri Lanka, Satyajit Ray, It's an earlier phase and national cinema, and it was the art cinema of a certain sort. The later third cinema is a different category altogether. It doesn't belong in this, and it died out also. It didn't seem to catch on because politically it became moribund in some way. Okay, third cinema. So this doesn't include third cinema. It's only the first thing of the third world cinema, the first wave of whatever. It includes all Yusuf Shaheen, all these guys. Okay, any other questions? David Lynch is a lady. He's generally called postmodern also. He wouldn't belong in this category. David Lynch is not. David Lynch seems to belong. I don't know exactly where to place David Lynch. I would call him satire of some sort. He's probably closer to Buñuel. I would put David Lynch closer to Buñuel. Buñuel doesn't belong in this, by the way. See, Buñuel's films never posit ambiguities like this. Okay, he's pretty clear. He's making fun of something. Buñuel never. You'll never find the kind of ambiguities, the kind of uncertainties, the kind of puzzles in Buñuel that you would find in somebody like Chabrol or somebody like Bergman. But when you see Bergman, you're talking about persona, right? You take a movie like Persona, you take a movie like The Silence, right? Now these movies are puzzling. You don't know what the hell this chap is saying, right? And you're forced to dig deeper and find out what is he trying to say. And your idea of what it is will be different from my idea of what it is. Buñuel never did this. Buñuel was always pretty sure whom he was debunking, whom he was making fun of. Okay.
But the abstractions of certain of his films, like
which one? Is there one film of his where his standpoint is not clear? He belongs actually in the commercial cinema mode, actually, like your Almodovar.
I mean, after a while he became commercial, but during, like, say, even the Andalusian Dog phase.
That's the only one film or two films or three films. Andalusian Dog, as I said, was avant-garde. Okay. Large Door is avant-garde. The same thing with Land Without Bread is avant-garde. But subsequently went to Mexico, it was all commercial after in Mexico. And after that, when he came back here, Belle de Jour and all that is commercial only.
Yeah, completely. Belle de Jour.
Belle de Jour. I mean, even Belle de Jour, but it's not ambiguity of this kind. I don't know. Okay. You're not asked to, how can Indian art cinema be related to post-war? No, it doesn't. Indian art cinema is a different category. It came out of the, it is not ambiguous at all. Indian art cinema, with the except for a few people like Adur and Arvindan and Ray and Ghatak, a few of them, by and large, it is not ambiguous. This puzzling Indian film which needs the interpretation is hardly ever there. Okay. So Indian art cinema, what is called art cinema in India, is a different category altogether, also nomenclature, but it does not belong in this category of world art cinema, which ends in India with Satyajit Ray by and large, though individually the other people have produced.
Say a film like Om Darbadar, probably.
Om Darbadar is one of a kind. I really don't know what to make of it. It's probably, I wouldn't say, they probably, your Kumar Shani, all of them may have come out of this movement. They were later entrance to this. Kumar Shani was deeply influenced by Bresson. Manikal would have probably, okay, but they're also making puzzling films in some sense. Yeah, you could say that. They probably more than Om Darbadar also possibly could belong to this moment. Yeah, because it's a very, again.
It has that, see, Om Darbadar, like Pere Le Fou or Weekend, it has that playfulness in it, like which
Agreed,
could be,
yeah.
termed as postmodernist.
I would say that, look, I understood first 20 minutes of that film. I thought it was amazing, that first 20 minutes. After that, I just lost it altogether. I couldn't make any sense of it. I couldn't even be drawn to interpreting it in some way.
Oh.
It was too much of a maverick exercise. There are a lot of, like, for example, there is this guy who made, he's another very difficult filmmaker. The man who made Trans-Europe Express, Alain Robbe-Grillet. There are a lot of other people who came out of it. He's also a very difficult filmmaker. There are a lot of, shall we say, filmmakers in Europe who came closer to the avant-garde in many ways. Marguerite Duras.
Yeah.
Marguerite Duras.
Yeah.
Okay.
Women of the
Marguerite
Ganges.
Duras, huh?
She made a River of the Ganges, right? And she wrote
India song she made.
Yeah.
Okay. So these are also difficult filmmakers in the sense that they wouldn't belong in, because they're extremely difficult and they are not operating by this. Marguerite Duras would probably be closer to your Kumar Shani and these people, in the sense that they're really, I mean, still a continuation of the avant-garde in some way. Okay.
Yeah.
Rene, I think, would belong in the art cinema. Hiroshima Mon Amour would belong in art cinema.
Yeah, Hiroshima Mon Amour
would probably belong to Straub, and Hewlett would belong to the, what I said about these people. Who? Your India song, Marguerite Duras. More and more avant-garde, Straub and Brechtian avant-garde. You don't go around trying to interpret them. I think they're pretty political and they're pretty clear about their politics. Whereas these filmmakers, Godard, until he became completely doctrinaire, was a very ambiguous in terms of he was deliberately positing ambiguities in his movies. What to make of this? What Fassbinder is another. Okay, extremely ambiguous. So all of these filmmakers were of a certain sort, and Herzog initially, I think, part of it. Then later on,
So, like the avant-garde is in a way distinguishable from the art cinema, are you saying?
Avant-garde doesn't have a theatrical release at all. Okay, these people had theatrical releases. For example, I doubt if Marguerite Duras ever got invited to a film festival or got an award in anything. She is basically a film writer. Okay, who tries to make a movie. There are other people. We not what's his name, Cocteau, for instance. I don't know how to put Cocteau. Cocteau also is not art cinema like this. He's probably closer to the avant-garde in some ways. Though he made fairly expensive movies, he was closer to the avant-garde. He's surrealist, actually.
What about
Paradianovich comes from the East, Russian. Okay, I wouldn't put him here at all. Keep all Russian, and Russian cinema is outside the scope of European. This is European art cinema and world art cinema. Russian cinema developed in a completely different balloon kind of thing. Okay, Russian Soviet. Very different.
Sometimes people categorize the French New Wave films with avant-garde films as avant-garde films.
No, it's a wrong usage. I mean, I'm trying to make that distinction here. You can't call, you can't.
Exactly.
Look, this word avant-garde is misused. You got to. Where did it come from? It's basically artistic experimentation of some sort. You can't call French New Wave had a public. It was not a large public, but it was there. Paying public was there. And it was shown in film festivals, it was shown in film theaters. You go to London today, there are theaters which show what is called art house, right? They have regular screenings of these movies. You won't see Marguerite Duras shown there, but you will find Fellini, you will find Romer, you will find Bergman, you will find these people there, right? Art house, but you won't find Marguerite Duras there.
So, is the distinction only in terms of the audience and the appeal of the film?
I think, look, I think by and large, if you ask me, avant-garde, okay, find sources of money somehow. They're not looking for a paying audience at all.
True.
Okay, but the art house is still looking for a paying audience. That makes a big difference. Okay.
Contemporary slow cinema.
What is? I don't know. I don't know what is slow cinema.
Slow cinema in terms of
Taiwanese fellow. Taiwan. What's his name? What is the Taiwanese guy?
The guy who made Burning, I think. Burning.
Tsai Ming-liang.
Tsai Ming-liang. Yeah, no, I know. These are all new things which have come. See, my story ends somewhere in the 70s, 80s, right? Now, subsequently, all kinds of things would come out of there. There would be the global art film. There would be this. There would be that. Global art film is something else. Okay, so we have to generally talking about all this. We have to generally, be a little circumspect when you say, is this guy part of the avant-garde? Is he part? You got to be a little careful. Obviously, not an avant-garde because they've got paying audiences, right? They are showcased in film festivals. There are retrospectives. He would be art cinema in some way, but exactly where it comes from, what thread, we don't know. That I wouldn't know. We'll have to look at that. Is that okay?
Yeah.
All right. So thanks a lot.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming in.
Yeah, bye.
Thank you so much for joining in, sir.
Thank you. Bye.